Welcome class. In this video we're going to look at completing the square, which is one of the more confusing topics for many students. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that in a video. So if we have any quadratic equation such as 2x squared minus 3x minus 2 equals 0, we can solve this using completing the square. So the good news about completing the square is that it's the same steps every single time. So if you forget the quadratic formula or don't know how to factor, this can be done no matter what your problem is. The bad news is that it can get kind of complicated sometimes and isn't exactly easy to remember. But practice is key. Doing several problems will help you. So the first thing I want to do is I want to divide everything by my leading coefficient. If your leading coefficient is 1, you don't have to do this, but otherwise you should do this because you can't complete the square until this is a 1. So this becomes x squared minus 3 halves x minus 1. Okay, my next step is I'm going to add 1 to both sides of my equation. So that gives me a 1 on the right side. The reason why I'm doing that is because we have to move our constant to the right side in order to complete the square. Okay, so you should just be left with an x squared and an x term over here. Okay, so now I'm going to do the actual part of completing the square. I'm going to take my number, the coefficient that's on my x term, and I'm going to multiply it by 1/2. So that gives me negative 3/4. Remember this number. Important. Remember. And then we're going to square this number. So that gives me 9/16. I'm going to add this 9/16 to both sides of my equation. Okay, on the right side, I have to get a common denominator to put these together. So that gives me a 16/16 plus 9/16 equals 25/16. And then on the left side of my equation, it can always be rewritten as x plus or minus whatever this number here is. In this case it's a minus, so minus 3/4. So this number that I put a little exclamation mark here to tell you to remember this goes here. Okay, so I have x minus 3/4 squared equals 25/16. Okay, now we can take the square root of both sides, which leaves me at x minus 3/4 equals, when I take the square root of both sides, that gives me plus or minus the square root of 25/16. I'm going to come over here to finish. So that gives me x minus 3/4 equals plus or minus, square root of 25 is 5. The square root of 16 is 4. Okay, that should be equal. Okay. Now I can move my 3/4 to the other side of my equation. So that gives me x equals 3/4 plus or minus 5/4. And then I can simplify this. So 3/4 plus 5/4 is 8/4, which is 2. And then 3/4 minus 5/4 is negative 2/4, which is negative 1/2. So there's my answer. X equals 2 or x equals negative 1/2. Sometimes you will get square roots when you do this. Sometimes the numbers are not very nice. But this does work every single time, no matter what. So let's do another one. let's do x squared minus 7x minus 4 equals 0. You could try to factor this, but there's no factors of 4 that can add or subtract to give you 7. So factoring doesn't work here, so you could use the quadratic formula. It works every time. Or completing the square works every time also. So I'm going to complete the square because that's what this video is about. I don't have to divide everything by this coefficient because it's a 1. Otherwise, you'd have to do that first. So let's go on to step 2, which is to move the 4 to the other side. Alright, now I'm going to take my negative 7 off to the side, times it by 1/2. So I get negative 7 halves. Remember this number. Then I'm going to square it to get 49 over 4. I'm going to add 49 over 4 to both sides of my equation. So I'm going to add 49 over 4 to both sides of my equation. Okay. Alright. So the left side of my equation is going to be x, this number, so minus 7/2 squared, equals, and then I have to get a common denominator here. So common denominator between a 1 and a 4 is 4, so that's 16 over 4 plus 49 over 4. So that will be, once we simplify, 16 plus 49 is, let's see, 59, 65 over 4. Alright, now we want to take the square root of both sides. So that's x minus 7/2 equals plus or minus the square root of 65 over 4. Okay, so 65 is not a perfect square, and there are no perfect squares inside of 65. So it stays inside the square root no matter what. However, the 4 on the bottom is a perfect square, so we can take that square root and pull it out. So I have x minus 7/2 equals plus or minus the square root of 65, and then outside the square root I have over 2. Now I can put my 7/2 on the other side. So 7/2 plus or minus square root of 65 over 2. And then just to make it look a little nicer, I can combine these two fractions. So I get x equals 7 plus or minus square root of 65 all over 2. And this is what you'd get if you did the quadratic formula also. And there's our answer. So hopefully this helped you. If not, watch the video again, practice the homework problems. There's several good videos online. Khan Academy has some good ones. Patrick JMT on YouTube also has some good ones. And as always, you can contact me if you have any other questions.